Well, out of necessity now, I really have to make an addendum to the discussion that I was responding to. I made my response at can't remember the 23-minute mark, I think. Now I'm going to make an addendum to that response. I've gotten further in. I'm now at like the 1 hour and 40-minute mark. 37-minute mark, 1 hour 37 minutes. Anyway, so there are a lot of things that I'm going to have to try to salvage some of the points that I made, because I do think that they are still pretty much intact, although they need further qualification. Because of there's been a lot of intelligent discussion. So perhaps I was a bit too blunt, but I'm still going to. It's going to be harder for me to make some of these more pointed critiques. Because I'm not capable of actually suggesting them and then hearing a response and then making establishing the point, because the point would generally have to be established in real time. So it doesn't really quite work from the outside, holding up a placard of criticism, because you don't know how it might be integrated or answered um, uh, into the discussion. But let me just get onto the substance then. So I think what is almost happening. It's interesting. I still want to go back and I did this in too much of a haphazard way. I need to discuss the gray area of redeeming some features within game A, which might be problematic. Uh, for the people that I'm addressing this to, and that really all comes from being able to criticize game A from the position of game B. But because game B is generally sort of is so nebulous, to in the context of this discussion, you know, um, defining game B as not game A is to kind of shirk the actual sort of definitional um, brief to clearly make the important distinguishing elements. But anyway, I understand that these people are sort of they're groping on some level and they have to start somewhere. So so yeah, I mean, they did kind of generally indicate that the general almost answer to everything is just to increase discerning. And I do think that this answers some of the open questions that were given throughout, that were asked throughout, which is, like, how do you do this, or whatever, or Jamie Wheel asked something about individuals being promoted by a kind of a general culture that's able to kind of support and platform their sovereignty. Again, this platform is not going to exist. I mean, it might exist in terms of people's short-term memory, or in terms of watching other people enact that kind of living culture and then sort of automatically inculcating themselves into that, or contrasting it with their game A conditioning and seeing just a completely different model of human interaction and negotiation and exchange. But the thing is that you can't. There's going to be no pervasive culture that is going to be able to support people. That you cannot create a set of rules. It does not work. Any rule can be technically abused in some sense. I mean, you could have a procedure in which you kind of forced people to have a kind of mediation process or something like that, which then would show people that actually, authority is not going to be used in some sense, and there's a procedure in aiding people in order to kind of work out what the contention really centers on, which can, maybe produce a platform that helps to magnify and elucidate, the kind of the failure in in whatever discursive, instrumental, kind of, I mean, there are lots of reasons why particular instances of discussion fail, um, which can really have to do with even elements of how an audience is kind of applying a certain kind of contextual pressure or something like that. Um, but yeah, the only way to actually safeguard anything is within each participant themselves. It is for them to safeguard their own integrity. It is for them to make their own case and to be empowered to do so in from their internal resources of and obviously perhaps having some scope in being able to hear out their side in their case. I mean, there are these brilliant principles in the Roman legal system, which was the bedrock of creating a kind of a radical sovereignty of reason and sort of, and audi autorem partem principle, a maxim. The other side must be heard is the only way to know that justice is seen to be done, which is also, you could say, the overarching principle of all law, is that justice must be seen to be done, which actually gives quite a lot of extra requirements than just the vague and nebulous promise that justice must be done or should be done, which then becomes a kind of ideologically touted um, interpretation upon reality, rather than one that gets borne out in whatever process is uh, utilized. Oh, yes, let me. So you know, there is no escaping the kind of the individual's level of judgment, and having that as the. I mean, there is no higher defense. That, there's no. You can't outsource these things, and yes, there is a risk that they're going to be dishonored. If people have selective hearing and such, if people have the whatever permission to rely on some arbitrary authority to affect such behavior. You know, this is slightly problematic. I mean, this to me brings up the idea of, while the Greeks, when they were trying to deal with a kind of abstract logic of mathematics, there was some level of confusion which was just completely intolerable to let's say the general intellectual culture of intellectual authenticity, because there were some manners of thinking which were just so corrosive and toxic, and problems that were so repetitive and recurring that people just, they didn't want to know anymore about the controversy. They just wanted it to be so that everyone could have their feet on the same platform, could share the same ground upon which to proceed. And that really got into the idea of, well, you mathematicians, if you have an argument, you go on a boat, you go out to sea, and you come back, and when you come back, there's only one school of thought, and the rest are extinguished. And that really is a that's a horrible metaphor in some sense, but it shows the commitment to there being a universal platform, a single purpose, a single truth, um, the one, the concept of the one, um, as a so that there can even be a kind of co- um, uh, to give the idea that coalescence itself has an innate dignity in it, and there is a human need for that. Anyway, I don't want to get into weird things. So I think one of the big issues here is that there's a bit too much wish thinking, I think, in the premise of this whole discussion. The idea that you're going to be able to have this outsourced collective sense making, that's impossible. In fact, it actually comes from what I would consider to be a game A inclination, which is, and there were some interesting things about game A, that there are these systems of command and control. Um, Jordan Hall described them quite well in terms of, what game A is is um, is forced into placating and dispensing and conserving, and because it has to conserve those features, um, wider ideas of coherence are effectively on the back burner and diminished. Although I would say that they're not sufficiently extinguished so much, because I would say that that they need to be tapped in some way. They need to be harvested probably in some form of game A, um, because it's not merely that game A's only pressure is not merely to outdo other things. I think that there's a version of game A in which it's also trying to outdo itself in terms of the imagination of the individuals uh, uh, are contained by game A. That there is an economy in that imagination which has to be placated to as well, which is something of a kind of simulacrum for the thing that would otherwise be able to engage in a sort of game B. So I do think that these things are somewhat interpenetrated in some half mixed up dynamic. And anyway, I just think that one of the things that in which, let's say, the tendency or capacity of human beings to develop something like game B has been subverted or seduced in terms of game A is game A's ability to generate something that almost simulates a higher economy, a more efficient economy, a more effective economy of purpose, which is not really a transparent purpose that's got mixed up with the three features that Jordan Hall mentioned, but it sort of it muddies the waters by being able to deliver more energy to its members in some sense, merely out of the fact that it generates an economy of scale, that because it's able to sort of to be a larger sort of thing, because it's able to use uniform authority, money being a great one. You don't need to communicate with people. You don't need the coherence of communication when you can use the medium of money to communicate something that is, in some sense, it's weird to say it in this way, is this forever unknown quantity in terms of what it is displacing, in terms of the dynamics of game B that would have to sort of um, that would have to be at work in order to deliver the same thing that game A is able to accomplish. Um, and so essentially you get this sort of, you're buying into the kind of the totemic efficacy of an economy of scale over a displaced or extracted from a displaced economy of purpose. And so, and I think that that is actually what these people are trying to do. They're trying to say, well, can we actually get rid of what we say we don't want, which is game A, and have a game B, which is actually capable of operating above and beyond the individual understanding and is kind of like a template culture that's just waiting for people to plug into it, and can it be sort of systematized in some sense, or kind of be a kind of objective vestige of of some kind of mechanism or procedure that's just waiting to be operated. Um, and that when it is done so, it's done so in a way in which other people might be able to kind of join in on it, sort of at a distance, or by sort of by being able to symbolically read what's going on, and have a sense of a sympathetic coherency which is being shared in basically just because we know that it's not game A, so therefore it must be game B or something like that. Essentially, I think what this is it's the idea of essentially trying to tap into the benefits of having an economy of scale, and just trying to extend that game A sort of mechanism um, into game B, which I do want to I do want to say that I think is actually the impetus of this whole vague and nebulous discussion is I'm sorry, I guess that's quite damning for the participants involved, because they were even at pains to sort of say that that's exactly what they don't want to do, and that's exactly what the problem would be, or something like that. But then I do want to get into the to try, because I understand that even just me saying the things that I've said in trying to, let's say, redeem some features within game A, I've probably not done that to their I've probably not done that in a proper enough way that it actually fits into the things that they've said. So I'm just trying to think how I could substantiate that point. Um, so in some sense, there is this, whatever game B is, right, from their perspective. Um, I think I've extended that slightly to just say it is a place, it is a space that it only exists within an individual, and in as much as that space is shared by other individuals, it's because they have the same internal resource that is being superimposed and then being compounded and therefore shared by other people. So it's an interior, it's accessed via the interior, and then it's sort of resonated in with other people. Um, the idea that that can sort of be outsourced or be made into a kind of vicarious, interrelated process is just it's just impossible. It's just it doesn't it's non-commensurable with a type of thing that it is. Um, the idea of that there's I don't think that there's necessarily is an absolute limit to these things. I think the so let me just say, I mean, when you go to an EDM concert, and this is one of the examples given, please excuse me if I don't recount it properly because I don't really know what I'm talking about. But if you go to an EDM concert and you're listening to the electronic music and you're taking whatever psychedelic thing and you're experiencing that, how easy it is to get into that spirit of communion when there's no um, there's no bearing that sense of I mean, so people are entering into a shared spiritual experience in some sense, but that's the space of that experience is so unbounded. It's so undemanding. It's almost as if we're all here to escape game A. You know, how many economies of purpose can fall in under that marshalling banner? It's not very um, sophisticated. You know, how much and so really, and the elements in game A that I really want to start redeeming are elements like law. There are some. I mean, law can be hideous. It can really be. There are worse and better forms of law. Where did I write that? So I've just got some notes here. So the thing that I want to say from game A is something like ideological reconciliation or ideological structures. Um, in some sense, ideological structures are problematic because they are not. To call them an ideological structure, you are binding yourself on purpose in a constructivist way. I mean, it's a lot easier to say, oh, we all share the same existentialist threat, therefore we are compelled, we are coerced, either by a narrative or by a cosmological factor or sort of material condition that we are all imprinted in or imprinted from. Um, that's easy. That's very easy. As soon as you've got something that is a choice, purely a choice, that choice is always open to revision. Um, and then you really have, are people capable of mastering their own minds in some sense, in that sense? And I spoke of the chapter in the Living with Nihilism, the chapter written by Vasti Root from Stellenbosch University. So again, I'd commend that reading as a kind of philosophical basis for this. But yeah, uh, so just to go on, law therefore is not necessarily a game A feature, depending on how it's related to. Um, how could how I mean, if anything, when you are trying to have a gathered meeting between people and there's a real contention within the group, there's a is something that is at least on in a non-open scenario would be an impasse. It requires perhaps quite a lot of work and ingenuity to work out how to resolve such a contention. What When you actually work out how that contention is solved, you that generates an understanding, and if you want to turn that understanding into a principle, so that you have a kind of a rudiment of continuing practice that happens um, in the aftermath going forward. I mean, if anything, that's what law can be in its pristine state. And if it's contending itself through principles and it's being and it has enough general principles that will seemingly conflict in certain places, you can still also have individuals that navigate those conflicts in real time. And then you have a legal community that will examine how they've articulated their integrity and will record the exploration and the discovery as a joint resource of a kind of introverted feeling in some sense, to use some Jungian jargon. But so how is law any different from actually trying to to have a gathered meeting in which there is a real contention therein? Law is not distinctly different from that, as long as law is operated not from the level of plenary control from a legislature, but it is developed from the ground up and has general principles which are anyway. So all of these things can be overlooked when you just have very basic scenarios where you just say, oh, well, we're all under the same existentialist shadow and threat. And there are also some elements in law which you could say are ideological in nature, and then they are almost choices, and there are trade-offs in that sense. And keeping a spiritual space that is a concerted spiritual effort of an act of self-determination. The idea that this is what you are chosen of, keeping that in view, so that your vision is not one of a vassal, but one of a participant. That requires a level of ideological reconciliation. Okay, now you can, in some implicit sense, you can have an ideological consensus that is just kind of abjectly pressed onto the circumstance, and things come to an head, and you have a gathered meeting, and all of or you could have a responsible community that's capable of dealing with these things with anticipation, with planning, with forethought. Um, you can't live in this state of ecstasy forever, and in fact, even when you are burdened with doing the work of working according to the plan, as it were, one can do that with the spirit that it is it is resonant with one's input and choice and self-determinism. But this is the sort of the distinction between the open and closed mode. There's a talk by John Cleese on this, on John Cleese on creativity, where he developed that lecture after having a studious examination of the quite top academic writings on what is known about play. Um, anyway, so okay, let me just see if I can just make another summary of this. So yeah, I do think that there's a fundamental philosophical propensity towards error here, because you can't just simply, and this is what I meant with saying that this is like what the liberals do. You cannot just say inequality is evil. In the same way, you cannot just say game A is evil, and you've got a descriptive moral code. it doesn't work. You have to be able to contend both positive and negative. That they're not just it's not just a binary dichotomy. There has to be a real robust understanding of these matters, which I do think have to be rooted primarily in psychology and in a philosophy, in philosophy of general matters that has a kind of cohesion within itself that would be tantamount to an ideological position of phenomenology or something like that. But yeah, I mean, philosophy has gotten a bad name in some sense. It's generally regarded as controversy without end, no consensus, no understanding, just disparate voices howling at each other. So I when I say philosophy, I almost want to displace that word and just call it ideology. Um, Doctrine. There actually has to be the development of a doctrine of psychology of mind and how it treats issues and objects of you know the interior composition, personality, um, and how that deals with constructs and themes and conceptualizations and uh, you know time itself and things like that, and until you have a kind of a comprehensive catalog of what the errors are, and these are defects, you could say, that in terms of people's judgment itself. And so this is what will give the individual a robust sense of being able to contend themselves with confidence and building something confidently and being able to safeguard themselves, their own integrity, is being able to contend diagnosis of others and themselves and a potential growing diagnosis of themselves. But if they're not willing to come to that point of, well, I can diagnose, I am the doctor. If you can't say that, then, what if you're going to try and give that to a kind of collective sense making, if you really are looking to donate that to some kind of vicarious system, yeah, so I guess the thing is that we do actually need structures that perhaps will look things like game A. There are things in game A that do need to be reclaimed by game B, I would say. We do need to find a way to appropriate some of those instruments and tools um, into the ability of the individual to diagnose. And this is why I do have actually some videos that recordings on my YouTube that specifically deal with these issues that have to do with the root of state corruption, which talks about South Africa, but it specifically talks about some constitutional issues and also how the law itself is meant to be interfaced with. And when I go on about the Napoleonic corruption of Western uh, legal systems in general. Let me just think. There are things. Sadly, I'm not even properly making reference to my own body of work that is specifically relevant to this. But anyway, let me stop this recording before I go babbling a bit too much. Just to summarize the key features of uh, the the bottom line and the sort of the consequences of what I'm saying is you need doctors, you need individuals that are doctors, and you need doctrine that is shared to have a common platform or a culture or something like that, of something that amounts to something like Game B. And you need the trust that these doctors can actually, uh, you know, propose diagnoses, and perhaps even systems of comprehending or sorting out differential diagnoses and things like that. But with these features, you don't have anything that is even capable of developing. And so, the idea that doctrine, that looks too much like structure, that looks too much like game A, like that's, it's just going to lead nowhere. It's just going to continue in a nebulous fashion into more and more vagaries, and it's just going to continue to always be metaphors. And what's the other point here is I just wanted to point out that this is also what is basically outlined in the Christian doctrine when it talks about rulers in the kingdom. We will all be judges and rulers in the kingdom. That is how it's described culturally. So the spirit of discerning, the spirit of judgment, the spirit of the Lord. These things are. They belong to each participant. Anyway. I mean, this is perhaps so banal that, I don't mean to seem to talk down to people. But, like all heuristics, they have I mean, obviously, they're not the same as principles, and there's an overarching principle that is perhaps being overlooked, which is that, there is something as the truth, and so giving someone the benefit of the doubt in order to go through the process of having an intellectual humility and vulnerability and susceptibility, one can also maximize that humility and susceptibility by being forthright and by being firm in one's diagnosis and robust enough to actually put enough of it on display that then it can be countermanded. So, merely just giving people the benefit of the doubt, I guess there's a difference between being timid and being humble, I guess. And yeah, and so what all these heuristics perhaps do, they don't quite function unless, is it a code of conduct in terms of, am I comporting myself according to this new style of this new group? Or what is the actual teleos that that is within it? And again, now I'm just sort of table thumping perhaps, but the idea is that you actually have to be able to diagnose, be the doctor in one's outlook and purport, and be capable of seeing that things are cutting both ways in terms of the doctrine, in terms of having a judgment that is actually an aid to the living, in some sense. And these things I do think generally are, their ultimate defense is a kind of epistemological pragmatism, which that also relates to the living with nihilism kind of thing. But I mean, the living with nihilism chapter that I keep on bringing up, she doesn't go so far, but because it does require another sort of arm of elaboration or extension from that. But I do see that is almost the philosophical foundation to something like the Christian doctrine, or at least what I consider to be the proper understanding of the Christian doctrine. Which is that authority comes from an awareness of darkness, and that is the really what arms the Spirit of the Lord with its uh, tendency to carry the weight of authority, is that it is contending with more things. Um, in terms of its structure, obviously in the early stages, you're just trying to try to avoid the kind of the obtuse problems and the kind of and the very broad brute forms of toxicity, uh, but you can't be bound by heuristics to the extent in which you end up discarding the baby with the bathwater in terms of not being able to deal with the nuanced sophistication, and this I think generally is what happens when you deal in a kind of vagueness, and you sort of you know you can't see the wood from the trees, and you've just been mesmerized essentially by these kinds of metaphorical themes and such. Um, and it's just not grounded. It's not grounded within the individual, which has to be prone to diagnosis. A diagnosis in accordance with some kind of doctrine, which is you know at some point you do have to be subservient and subject to something. Jamie Wheel, I think, brought out this point, and what that thing is the understanding. You have to comport an understanding. You know, this is the gold within the earthen vessels. This is the treasure. Um, is the understanding of contending a self-determined free choice. Uh, yeah, and that's the kind of ideological sort of umbrella that eventually, perhaps can infuse an entire culture. But it's not going to be this kind of pervasive, you can call it perhaps a high trust society or something like that. Um, but the trust really must come in the way that it came in the Roman civilization, where you knew that you essentially could rely on the courts, the impartiality of the procedure, and that obviously it was sort of bound within certain stricture, but there was a secularity in terms of how that stricture would not be corrupted by bias, and how it had built in procedures for regulating itself and balancing itself in that way. Now, this is a slight dangerous metaphor, because you cannot just displace these things with grooves and things like that. The treasure here is the idea of a robust trust. Um, and the cultivation of trust, and the currency of trust within that idea of community as being the uh, as being the real money or something. But some of these metaphors are painfully dangerous, I guess, because I'm not encouraging people to commodify such metaphysical values and interests, but so what's the point? Is So in a low resolution way, the idea of a kind of intellectual humility and trying to conserve while circumlocating, is that the word? Circumnavigating, navigating, sort of in the vicinity thereof, and tracing the outskirts, and perhaps not actually laying down the clear and distinct territory of within and without, and just merely trying to sort of cut away at what we know is wrong and be left with something. It doesn't, sadly, it's just too much of an obtuse operation to actually land up claiming that space. It doesn't ever have the confidence. It doesn't ever have the voice of being an agent of game B. It doesn't have that idea of delineating itself as a kind of, let's just say, identity. But in it's weird because the idea of a spiritual identity, it is faced with some of the challenges that are almost within identity politics, but they are solved in a very particular kind of doctrinal fashion, where, well, if your identity is the Son of God, and so it actually takes upon itself a universal accountability and responsibility, so that it doesn't sort of diffuse its own responsibility into the system at large, or the corruption or something like that, that it takes it upon itself, and that in fact, when it takes it upon itself, it uses that special identity as a group noun that can pertain to other beings as well, and so it, hypothetically at least, universally shares that power with others, which it seeks to sort of contact and commune with, that is in principle extended to one's neighbors. Then you've got everything. You've got an identity, and you've got a bridge for something that breaks down the kind of the existentialist plight of a kind of solipsism or something like that. So you're sort of, by confronting the philosophical problem head on, by accepting it as a genuine problem, you out of your own volition, out of your own free choice, you are crafting the solution. So the solution is the construction in the exercise of freedom, the pursuit of freedom, the pursuit of liberty. That is the philosophical, so essentially how the universe grants us our free will is not by granting it to us, but by granting us the obstacle that cannot be denied, that can be accepted either way, but is overcome by those who are heard, by heard of the answer. They hear the answer. They didn't read it. It's not imprinted upon them, so in some sense it is what they are chosen of. It resonates with their character, with their being, that that has a that agreement, willing, to entreat others by that same declaration of internally held constitution slash faith, you know. Anyway. I don't think I can model it more than that. I feel compelled to add just another sort of layer of explanation. And this is something that is slightly tangential, but so, just going into the different roles available in a kind of in the aspect of a kind of robust and authentic discovery that can be shared in a joint project or something like that. And I think this comes from the sense that there is a shared singular platform, a shared singular truth, but that there are facilities upon that platform that have that each have their own role, you know, and so you're able to get into, let's say, even on some in some irrelevant way, there is a destruction that precipitates creation, or a displacement of things. You know, that there is a kind of that the flesh can be sacrificed in the crucible of some kind of communal integration, because you're listening out for just those roles being filled and populated in one's in the shared space of the model or something like that, which is coming into sharper and a more transparent realization and focus. And you know, this actually can be explained through a kind of metaphysical understanding of where the psyche and how consciousness intersects with philosophical certain things. But basically, because what is happening in the present is just a kind of is subject to coming in within the parcel of the flesh itself, in some sense. That's the only way that the present manifests. But it is recorded in how it is recorded. There's a whole spectrum of things that are woven into that you could call it that account. And so much as that there is a doctrine that is tacit or implicit, that is tacit or patent in its joint understanding. You know, it doesn't have to be patently articulated so much as it is tacitly shared in understanding. That is where those various roles, you know, so people can be contributing differentially to the fulfillment of those roles, you know, and so much so is that they are capable of compounding into a single accord, into, you know, they will have they are not all the same gift. Those roles are distinct gifts which are being compounded in concert with one another. But that only happens in the account, in the record of the present. And yeah, it's interesting because in some sense that there are three different prime drivers within the seat of consciousness that is purveying, you know, in some sense the to describe it very generally and nebulously, awareness of the past, awareness of the present, and awareness of the future. And so as not to contradict myself, the awareness of the future is not past, PARSED, is not past as a, that takes the form of a kind of formlessness, uh, that is this, uh, it's sort of associated with, let me think of a good idea.